They're calling it a refund boom. They're selling it like a stimulus, like a gift, like proof the economy is turning a corner. But what if I told you the loudest economic promise in America right now isn't a new policy at all? It's your own money coming back to you, rebranded as a political victory. Because when a government has to market a tax refund as a breakthrough, that's not governance, that's performance. And once you see that, you start to see the deeper story. Why the US political system no longer functions as intended. Not because it has collapsed, not because the Constitution vanished, but because the operating logic has changed. The system still moves. It still produces headlines, speeches, bills, court fights, and official statements. Yet somehow it keeps generating outcomes that feel detached from the design Americans were promised: accountability, restraint, and a fair contest between competing visions. What we're watching now is something else. We're watching a political economy that increasingly runs on narrative substitution, legal routing, and institutional capture. The outcome is decided first. Then the story is built to make it feel natural. The refund boom is the cleanest case study you could ask for. Picture a working household in the Midwest. 2 earners, rent, groceries, a car note, maybe childcare. They're not reading treasury statements. They're not parsing the difference between fiscal stimulus and tax administration. They're living month to month, watching prices stay stubborn, watching rates squeeze credit, watching layoffs hit in pockets even when national headlines say the labor market is fine. Then refund season arrives, and suddenly there's a number on a screen, a few $1,000s, a brief moment of relief. Now here's the question. Is that relief being treated as a normal function of the tax system, or is it being used as an engineered political event? Because there's a huge difference. A tax refund is not a new benefit. It's not a bold program. It's not an innovation that lifts living standards. It's often the product of withholding schedules and payroll math and timing. In many cases, it's the government returning money that was overpaid throughout the year. So why frame it like a demand-boosting plan? Because it does something policy can't do quickly. It changes the mood. It creates the emotional experience of getting a check. It looks like the government is delivering something tangible, and it arrives right when public confidence is most fragile. In other words, it's a perfect political patch. And this is where the system shows its dysfunction. In a system that functions as intended, leaders would argue over real policy trade-offs: what to spend, what to tax, what to cut, what to regulate, and who benefits. They'd defend those choices and voters would judge them. But in a system that's drifting, something else happens. Ordinary mechanics get repackaged as extraordinary achievements. Refunds become stimulus. Bureaucratic timing becomes economic strategy. The narrative substitutes for the policy. That's not a small distortion. It's a signal that the system is leaning on optics because the underlying story isn't strong enough to stand on its own. Now, connect that to the other pillar of this moment: tariffs. Tariffs are being sold as if they're a miracle lever, a way to punish rivals, protect domestic jobs, raise government revenue, and reduce pain without anyone paying the bill. It's politically elegant because it's easy to explain and emotionally satisfying. Someone else is the villain, someone else pays. But tariffs don't behave like slogans, they behave like taxes. They raise input costs, they reroute supply chains, they invite retaliation. They shift prices in ways that are hard to predict and harder to control. Even when they collect revenue, that revenue does not arrive out of thin air. It arrives through someone paying more somewhere, often in diffuse, indirect ways that don't look like a tax, but feel like one at the checkout counter. If the promised tariff dividend doesn't materialize at the scale that was implied, then the political system faces a problem. Not a policy problem, a narrative problem. So you pivot. You don't concede. You don't say, "We oversold it." You build a new story. You point to refunds. You point to timing. You point to a new concept that sounds like a benefit. And you move the camera away from the gap between the promise and the reality. That gap is where institutional trust goes to die. Now, to be fair, there's a reasonable argument for tariffs. Some people will say, we need them to protect domestic industry, rebuild supply chains, reduce dependency, and strengthen national security. They'll say the old free trade consensus hollowed out communities and concentrated wealth. They'll say targeted tariffs can be part of a serious industrial strategy. That argument deserves to be heard. The problem is not that a country debates tariffs. The problem is how power behaves when tariffs become a tool of permanent politics rather than a policy with measurable goals. Because once tariffs are treated as a political identity rather than an economic instrument, the system stops asking, what is the cost? Who pays it? What is the timeline? What is the exit plan? What is the metric for success? Instead, it asks, does the message land? And when the message is everything, the institutions become props. That brings us to the most under-discussed part of this story, the way the system increasingly routes around constraints. In theory, American government is built on friction. The executive proposes, Congress legislates, courts review, agencies implement. Power is supposed to collide with other power. That collision is not a flaw, it's the feature. Because in a country this large, this diverse, and this economically complex, concentrated power is not just risky, it's destabilizing. So when courts challenge executive authority on major tools like tariffs, the design is supposed to force a reset. It's supposed to compel political negotiation. If the executive can't do it alone, it must persuade Congress. If Congress won't authorize it, the policy stops, or changes, or becomes narrower and more defensible. But here's what's happening more and more. Instead of stopping, power reroutes. A new legal basis, a different statute, a procedural workaround, a change in framing that allows the same policy outcome through a different door. This is not always illegal, that's the point. It's legal engineering. And legal engineering is how a system can look constitutional while functioning in a way the public didn't consent to. It's how checks become speed bumps instead of stop signs. It's how constraints become puzzles to solve rather than limits to respect. If you want to know why the U.S. political system no longer functions as intended, look closely at that shift. When the default response to oversight is not deliberation but circumvention, the spirit of the system is already gone, even if the form remains. Now we have to talk about the Federal Reserve, because this is where the story moves from messy politics to dangerous institutional drift. For decades, the basic bargain was simple. The Fed is independent enough to resist election cycle pressure. In exchange, the public gets monetary policy that aims for long-run stability rather than short-run political payoff. Sometimes that means unpopular decisions. Sometimes it means restraint. Sometimes it means being the adult in the room when politics is chasing a sugar high. But independence is not a law of nature. It's a norm. And norms survive only as long as leaders treat them as legitimate. What we're seeing now is independence being reframed. Not openly abolished, not formally repealed. Reframed. Independent now starts to mean independent as long as you agree. And that is the death of the institution. Because the moment the public believes the Fed chair must be politically aligned, every future decision becomes suspect. Rate cuts become favors. Rate holds become punishments. Inflation becomes a partisan story. Market confidence becomes fragile. And once confidence fractures, the consequences travel far beyond one administration or one election. This is why personnel fights around the Fed matter. It's not just about who sits in the chair. It's about whether monetary authority remains a stabilizing counterweight or becomes an extension of political strategy. And it's not only about the Fed itself. It's about what happens when fiscal and political pressures begin to dominate monetary policy. When governments rely on certain narratives to maintain legitimacy, they will also pressure institutions to conform to those narratives. If inflation is politically inconvenient, define it differently. If rates are politically painful, demand cuts. If the data contradicts the story, manage the story. That brings us to one of the most revealing dynamics of our time: truth as a communications problem. There are moments when someone inside the system says something that's basically obvious, but still taboo. A moment when reality leaks through the script. For example, acknowledging that parts of the economy were recovering on their own after the pandemic. Vaccines, reopening, demand returning, job growth beating expectations. You can debate policy choices around stimulus and inflation. You can argue about timing and magnitude. But the simple fact that recovery momentum existed is not controversial in data terms. Yet in a hyper-politicized system, even that becomes dangerous. Not because it's wrong, because it complicates the narrative. And when the system treats factual complexity as a risk, it stops being a democratic system built for debate. It becomes a power system built for message discipline. This is why people feel the contradiction in their bones. The system still runs, but it doesn't resolve. It cycles, it performs, it shouts, it blames, it spins, but it rarely delivers the clean accountability that the founder's design implies, that competing institutions will check each other, that law will restrain power, that voters can judge outcomes based on honest arguments. Instead, we get a new operating model. Narrative substitutes for policy. Legal routing substitutes for consent. Institutional alignment substitutes for independence. And emotional relief substitutes for structural repair. So what does this mean for you, the person listening? It means that the most important question is no longer, will I get a bigger refund? The question is, what kind of system needs to sell refunds as triumph? Because if the headline economic message to working people is, you'll get back what you already overpaid, then the politics is not about building prosperity. It's about managing perception. And once perception management becomes the core tool, the incentives shift. Leaders optimize for moments, not outcomes. They optimize for quarters, not decades. They optimize for narratives that survive the news cycle, not reforms that survive reality. Now here's the forecast, the part most coverage avoids because it forces you to think structurally. If tariffs remain central and broad, price pressure becomes stickier, not necessarily through dramatic spikes, but through persistent friction. Higher costs here, weaker competition there, supply adjustments that never fully settle. That creates a political trap. People demand relief, but relief requires reversing the very policy that has become a political identity. So the system searches for substitutes. Refund narratives, blame narratives, institutional pressure. If courts restrict one pathway, legal engineering expands. New authorities, new rationales, new routes. The public sees lawsuits and assumes checks exist. But behind the scenes, the goal is continuity of outcome, not continuity of process. And if the Fed is pushed toward alignment, then the final safeguard weakens. The last institution that can plausibly claim to be above the fight becomes another battlefield. At that point, the U.S. political system doesn't need a dramatic collapse to fail its design. It simply becomes a machine that produces power efficiently and accountability poorly. That is how democracies decay, not in one night, but through normalization. And the most effective normalization tool is always the same: a story that feels like relief, a check, a refund, a headline, a promise that the pain is about to ease. Because the moment you feel relief, you stop asking how it was manufactured. Seeing America and power more clearly. Now I want to hear from you, because this is the real question Americans are avoiding. Do you believe the U.S. can restore real checks and balances through normal elections and normal reforms? Or does it take a genuine crisis for the system to remember what it was designed to do?